Greetings and welcome to TrainSignal. You're watching a lesson under Core Solutions for the Microsoft Exam 70-341, which is focused on Exchange 2013 Core Solutions. The primary heading is Plan, Install, Configure, and Manage Transport, and the subheading is Design a Transport Solution. So the primary focus for this lesson revolves around designing decisions for a transport solution within your Exchange 2013 environment. Now, this objective may include, but is not limited to, designing inter-site mail flow, designing inter-org mail flow, planning for domain secure TLS, designing edge transport, designing message hygiene solutions, and designing shared namespace solutions. It's a lot of information to cover all in one lesson. However, keep in mind, the main focus here is on concepts. We're going to be discussing the conceptual side to this so that when it comes to design for deployment of Exchange 2013 in various environment settings, you'll have an understanding in terms of what you can do with Exchange 2013, and more importantly, how things work behind the scenes in Exchange 2013. Okay, so let's get started. The scenario that we're focused on for this discussion is a company called Replace-A-Toy. So they are an emergent toy company that's based in Rhode Island. Now they do make toys, but their main focus is on trying to find lost toys and remaking lost toys if necessary. So let's say you have a child that loses their favorite little puppy dog plush toy and it's 5 years old and you can't find a copy of it on eBay. If you have pictures of the little puppy dog, you can send it to Replace-A-Toy, and if they can't find one, then they will remake the toy as best as possible. It's a great idea. Now, the problem they're facing is that they want to transition to Exchange 2013 from Exchange 2010, and they're concerned about mail flow issues. They need to design Exchange to allow for mail flow transport as the company expands to multiple sites and establishes partnerships. Currently, they do have 3 sites, but they're looking to add a 4th and possibly even a 5th site with Exchange deployed within each site. They're currently using 2010 Edge Transport servers to ensure that their perimeter is protected with anti-spam settings that are configured and so forth. So the goal here is to review important transport solution features that are essential when designing and deploying Exchange 2013. Now, some of these transport features are exactly the same with Exchange 2010, and so it's not to say that going with Exchange 2013 is going to change their world all that much. However, being that they are expanding as well, there are certain aspects to Exchange, whether it's 2010 or 2013, that's important for them to know about in order for them to understand the way things will work as they expand and as they establish these partnerships with other companies. Now, here's a view of the Exchange 2013 transport pipeline. We've discussed the Exchange transport pipeline in a previous lesson. The focus here, and the reason for the diagram, is to understand that the transport service handles the routing of messages. Now, there's a component of the transport service that's called the categorizer, and that handles all incoming messages and decides what to do with them. So ultimately, the message has to be categorized, and then the recipient resolution and ultimate destination routing can be worked out from that point. The ultimate destination is called the routing destination, whether it's a database, a connector like a send connector, or a delivery agent connector, or perhaps a foreign connector if it's a non-SMTP message, or perhaps it's a distribution group expansion server, which could be a hub transport server running Exchange 2010, or an Exchange 2013 mailbox server. So there may be quite a number of different routing destinations that the categorizer has to look at and determine where this message is going. But if you just look at the way this is all mapped out here, you can see that the transport service, it doesn't actually communicate directly with the database or databases. That's something that the mailbox transport service handles. Now, that mailbox transport service communicates with the local mailbox database using remote procedure calls, or RPC. But when communicating with other servers, it uses SMTP. So having a little bit of background in terms of how this transport pipeline works and what's going on behind the scenes can be very helpful when it comes to understanding how this works beyond a single site, which would be more of an intra-organizational discussion, which we've had in a previous lesson. Now we need to look at how this would function, how transport functions on a larger scale, let's say between sites that are part of the same Active Directory, and then expanding it even more so between different organizations. Now, typically, when you want to send an email to another organization, you can have a simple send connector that just sends it out to the internet. But there are times when you might have partnerships in play, and during those times you might want to establish more of an inter-organizational connection through send connectors that are very specific. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But let's take a look back at the concept of routing destinations first and see if we can understand a little bit better how Exchange actually moves mail flow between different destinations within an organization. So as was mentioned, there are a variety of different routing destinations that can be considered by the Exchange server, whether it's a database or a connector, or perhaps an expansion server for a distribution group. And all routing destinations have one or more servers, whether it's a hub transport server for Exchange 2010 or a mailbox server for Exchange 2013. And so we mentioned both because you might have a mixed environment, especially as you're transitioning from the 2010 over to the 2013 side. And so you have these different servers that handle delivering messages to that routing destination. Now you might say, well, how do we know which server is handling the actual flow of things here? Well, the type of server, whether it's a hub transport server with 2010 or a mailbox server with 2013, will depend upon the server that's holding the mailbox database. So if the mailbox is on an Exchange 2010 mailbox server, then you would need a hub transport server running Exchange 2010 to deliver that message. And so it's responsible for making that happen. So keep in mind, if you still have Exchange 2010 mailboxes on Exchange 2010 mailbox servers, you cannot get rid of your hub transport servers. Another important thing to note is that if the destination is not a database, we've been focusing on databases here, but let's say it's a connector or it's an expansion server, that delivery group may include a mixture of both, the hub transport servers running 2010 or a mailbox server running 2013. But of course, this only matters if you have a mixed environment. So remember, we started off with a scenario where the company that we're working with is starting with 2010. They're going to be transitioning, so there is going to be a mixed environment or a coexisting environment for a period of time. So during that time, there'll be this mixture of both. Now we mention the term delivery group here. It's good to note that there are different types of delivery groups. Let's discuss these. So here are some of the different types of delivery groups that the Exchange organization has to be aware of. For starters, there's the routable DAG. This is a collection of Exchange 2013 mailbox servers that belong to a DAG. So when we look at a DAG is actually a delivery group boundary, which is very similar to a transport boundary that we've discussed in a previous lesson. So when a message comes into a transport service on a 2013 mailbox server, and that mailbox server, let's say, is part of a DAG, it will route directly to the mailbox server where the active database is. And then from there, it will be delivered to the local database by the mailbox transport service of that server. So in this case, when you're looking at DAGs that are made up of Exchange 2013 mailbox servers, the site is not the delivery group boundary. In much the same way, it's not a transport boundary. It's actually the fact that they're all part of a DAG. The DAG becomes the delivery group boundary in those cases. Now that's different from a mail delivery group, which is a collection of Exchange servers that's all under one Active Directory site. So in that case, the Active Directory site is the boundary. So it doesn't matter if it's an Exchange server running 2010 or if it's an Exchange server running 2013. None of that really matters. Delivery in that case is handled by either an Exchange 2010 hub transport server or a mailbox server running Exchange 2013. But all of that is handled within the site. And so that's a situation where you don't have a routable DAG. Then there's connector source servers. So these are mixed servers, whether it's 2010 or 2013, that have send connectors or delivery agent connectors or foreign connectors that are scoped. And what that means is the server is the only one that's allowed to route messages to the destination stipulated by the connector. So in those situations where you have connectors that are scoped, that basically adjusts, or it actually interferes with the normal default flow of mail. And so in those cases, those mixed servers have that ability to route messages to the destination. Another delivery group type is an Active Directory site itself. Sometimes this is based upon the fact that the Active Directory site is a hub site and it's along the least cost path, although there are other reasons why an Active Directory site might be a delivery group for passing messages through. But in this case, the Active Directory site becomes a delivery group type. And the final delivery group is a server list, which is where a distribution group expansion server has been defined. And so in that case, delivery is automatically routed, perhaps outside of the normal routing of things, it gets routed to that server list. So the first two are more of the default flow of things, where if it's part of a DAG and it's Exchange 2013, the flow of mail will actually work within that DAG. And so the DAG becomes the delivery group boundary. When it comes to the mail delivery group, we're looking at a mixture of server types, whether it's 2010 or 2013, and we're looking at a situation where it's all based upon Active Directory sites. But then the other three, the connector source servers, Active Directory site, which is really when it's a hub site, and server list, this is where something has been configured that actually interferes with the default flow of mail and actually forces things to work a different way. So we have these different types of delivery groups. The big question that you might be thinking is, how are messages routed between delivery groups, which is more of an inter-site delivery of mail, and between organizations, or an inter-organizational delivery of mail? So granted, you have intra-site where you might have all of your servers within one location, and so that makes for an easy discussion in terms of how mail is routed from one place to another, because ultimately they just look for the nearest Exchange server where the mailbox is held, and it can just move the mail to that mailbox server, and then the mailbox transport service can just make sure that it goes in the local database. But what happens when you're dealing with multiple sites in the same Active Directory forest? And what happens when you're dealing with, let's say, two different organizations completely that want to have mail flow between them directly? So that's all part of understanding the way Exchange works in terms of transport. Keep in mind, we can dive so much deeper here. There is plenty of additional information, and you can learn more by looking at the various links at the end of this lesson that connect you back to discussions on routing and mail flow and so forth. All of that is through either TechNet or the Exchange team blog. So for more information on how all of this works, I recommend you certainly take the time to read those articles. Routing a message between sites is based on least cost routing through IP site links. Now keep in mind, this is not different from Exchange 2010. So the way this works is, by default, all Active Directory forests, they start with a single Active Directory site. It's called default first site name, and that's associated with one or more subnets. Now, if you're studying Exchange 2013 on this level, you should already know about the various features of Active Directory. So none of this should be new information for you. So you understand that there's an Active Directory forest, you understand that by default you have this default first site name, and then from there you can create additional sites by establishing additional subnets and then assigning them to the new sites. Then when you establish new servers, those servers get assigned to a site based upon their IP address, so long as the IP address fits within one of the subnets that you've established for the various sites that you've created. Exchange is a site-aware application. That's the official term for what it does. It's site-aware, in that it uses the Active Directory topology for message routing. So when you ask the question, hey, how do messages get routed from one site to another in the Exchange organization? The answer is, it's done through the Active Directory topology by default. And that really makes a lot of sense when you think about the replication of information that has to take place within an Active Directory organization between sites, between various domain controllers. There's obviously something that's already there that establishes some form of connectivity and a logical representation of how that data can be transferred back and forth, as well as, of course, physical connectivity between these Active Directory sites. And so all of that is utilized when you bring things into an Exchange discussion, because Exchange is a site-aware application. So keeping that in mind, let's discuss IP site links. So for those of you who are experts in the field of Active Directory, let's discuss Site Links 101. Basically, site links are logical paths between Active Directory sites. They're not physical, and that's why it's easy to just draw them as lines here. And really, when you look at these arrows, they could just be one-way arrows going to one site and then another arrow coming back. They could be two arrows for each location. That's the way Microsoft would basically draw it out, but it's just as easy to put a two-way arrowhead here. So when we look at this, costs are basically assigned to each of the connections, and it's based on network reliability, speed, and bandwidth availability. The default cost is 100. Site links are transitive. So if Site A communicates with Site B and Site B communicates with C, well, this would create a connection between A and C as well. So the site links are transitive between all of the different sites. Now, by default, Exchange uses site links to determine the least cost path, but not if two sites are directly connected. So if two sites are connected, that's the least cost path. Then Site A, if it's able to directly connect with Site C from a physical perspective, then it's going to just transfer information back and forth with Site C. If it could not communicate directly with Site C and it had to go through another site, well, that's where the least cost path comes into play. And that's where the costs that are associated with site links come into play. So it's important to note that Exchange uses site links only when determining that least cost path. But it will always try to deliver messages directly to the destination, either hub transport server or mailbox server running 2013. So when you look at a situation like this, there would be default costs that have been established, and then depending on the network reliability, the speed, and the bandwidth availability, these costs can be adjusted to really reflect more accurately the best path for Active Directory replication and then correspondingly Exchange routing of email. But what if you wanted to intervene in the process and you wanted to make adjustments in terms of how mail flows within the organization? Now you might think, well, I could just adjust the Active Directory site links myself. But what if you were not responsible for Active Directory? What if your responsibility was Exchange, but let's say there was another team and it was their responsibility to handle the Active Directory side? So you may not have control over the site links that are existing within your organization. That doesn't mean that you have no control over how mail flows within the organization, however. That doesn't mean, however, that you have no control. So let's talk about Exchange-specific costs. Now we're going to talk about Exchange-specific costs. But usually the site links are good enough and the topology is efficient enough for your Exchange routing to just utilize the Active Directory as is. So keep that in mind. You don't want to go micromanaging all of the different costs within your organization if you don't have to. But it's good to know that if you wanted to make a change in terms of how mail flows, you could do that. So if you need to make a change for Exchange, not necessarily the entire Active Directory environment, you can use the set-ad sitelink commandlet to assign Exchange-specific costs. So using that ad sitelink commandlet, you can actually say you want the connection between, let's say, site D and site C to have a different cost than what we currently see. So here we're looking at costs of 30 for site A to B, for site A to C. We're looking at costs of 10 for B to D, D to C, and then B to C. So we look at this and we say, okay, so there's some math that we would have to do in order to figure out what the least cost routing might be in this circumstance. But if we wanted to change the way things are routed, let's say we felt that the connection between D and C was too slow, not appropriate for sending email, not appropriate for mail flow in our case, well, we can actually add some cost to that by adding an exchange cost into the picture. It's also good to note that you can use that set-AD site link to establish a maximum message size on an Active Directory link. So you can use that commandlet there to do that, but it's important to note that if you do use the set-AD site link commandlet to establish a maximum message size, then what will happen is a non-delivery report will be kicked back for those that send messages that are too large. Now, in addition to adjusting the various costs for how you want mail to flow, sometimes you may want to force mail to flow a certain way within your organization. So to do that, you can manipulate exchange costs, or you can force mail to go through specific sites by designating them hub sites. So to do that, you use the set-AD site commandlet to set up a hub site. Now, the way this works is the hub site has to exist along the least cost routing path for message delivery. So the way this works is before email is routed to a final destination, the least cost routing path is first chosen. So once that's determined, then routing will determine if there's a hub site along that routing path. So if a hub site is configured, then messages will then stop at the transport server, whether it's a hub transport server or a mailbox server, in the hub site before being relayed forward to the target destination. But again, this variation to direct relay routing is only in effect when the hub site is located along the least cost routing path. So if you look at this, you can see up at the top that if site B wanted to send a message to site C, and it had to go through either site A or site D, well, in that case, on the left-hand side, the least cost path is actually through site A to start with. So it would use that least cost path. However, if you look at the other example on the right-hand side, in that case, the cost to go through site D is actually the least cost path. So even though site A is designated as a hub site, the mail would not flow through site A because the least cost path actually takes it through site D. So obviously this can become a little bit more complicated when you're dealing with more sites along the way, and when you're dealing with various levels of physical connectivity, different costs that are involved. It can be quite complex. But when you're looking at this, it's just good to note that you can establish hub sites, but the messages will not route through a hub site unless the costs also line up. So it has to be on the least cost path in order for the hub site to come into play at all. Now, we've been talking about the way mail flows within an organization, whether it's within a single site or if it has to be sent through other sites or site to site. And so that's inter-site mail flow. But now we want to talk for a moment about inter-org mail flow or inter-organizational mail flow. You know, you can always send mail out to the internet and let it find its way to a destination organization. That's easy enough. You can use a send connector that points off to either a smart host, or you can use DNS records to locate receiving messaging servers for direct recipient outbound mail flow. Sometimes, however, you want to connect to another organization for mail flow, perhaps because you have a partner that you wish to email through a more secure channel. So this is accomplished through connectors. Typically you establish send and receive connectors in order to create these partnership connections. So ultimately, you can configure partnership connectors that ensure communication is encrypted and secure between you and your trusted partner. And the connectors that you establish in the case of a partnership will only accept connections with servers that use transport layer security in order to authenticate. And so these are not all that difficult to configure, and it gives you the ability to ensure that you have the exact level of security that you want between you and your partner organization. Now, let's switch gears for a moment and let's talk about edge transport considerations. So currently, at the time of this recording, there is no Exchange 2013 Edge Transport Server role. There's talk that that might change, So perhaps with Service Pack 1, or perhaps as we move forward, we'll see a change in this and there will be an Exchange 2013 Edge Transport Server. But for now, you can continue to use or install fresh Exchange 2007 or Exchange 2010 Edge Transport servers. So this is something that you can continue to work with if you want to establish some type of perimeter security between the outside world and your internal organization. Now, as far as the subscription process, you subscribe the Edge to the Mailbox server role with Exchange 2013. So in the past, you would subscribe it with the Hub Transport server role, whether it was 2007 or 2010 Exchange servers. But with the change now, and there's no longer a Hub Transport server, you actually now can subscribe to the 2013 server. Really, the value of the Edge subscription process is that everything is done for you in the end. The send connectors are created, the receive connectors, and so forth, and so that's nice. And as mentioned, you should be able to subscribe to Exchange 2013 mailbox servers without a problem. However, if you do have problems, you can also do it manually by creating manual send-receive connectors on both the Edge Transport server and the mailbox servers. So that's something that you can consider if you are having problems with the subscription process. Now, it's important to keep in mind that you don't necessarily need Edge Transport servers. This is an extra server role piece that you can include into the picture, put on your perimeter network, and ensure that you have that extra step in between the outside world and your internal Exchange organization. Typically, the Edge Transport server is used to protect your organization from spam, as well as to enable the ability to have certain transport rules on that Edge Transport server that you can utilize to ensure that mail is going in the direction it needs to be, or mail is dropped when you don't want it to come into your organization, and so forth. So the transport rules are a little bit different on the Edge Transport server because of the functionality there on the perimeter. At the same time, you might be using some other type of antivirus solution in your organization. Perhaps you've installed it on the Edge Transport, perhaps you have a separate box for it, perhaps it's some type of forefront threat management gateway solution. So there are a lot of options for that perimeter network. At the same time, you might have a hosted solution. So your mail might be coming into your Exchange organization, but there's a solution that's hosted either by Microsoft or through some other third-party agency that handles things like archiving, anti-spam, antivirus, and so forth, and it's all handled out there in the cloud before that mail comes into your organization. So seriously, there are 100 different ways you can configure your Exchange organization to protect it from spam, to ensure certain elements are there on the perimeter before it comes into your organization. The Edge Transport server is one of those types of elements you might utilize, but you don't necessarily need one. Now, we mentioned anti-spam, and that's something that's built into the Exchange 2007 and 2010 Edge Transport server. But it's good to note that anti-spam is built right into Exchange 2013, and it's part of the message hygiene features of Exchange 2013. So when it comes to thinking about this and putting this as part of your design, it's good to note that the mailbox server role, it has anti-spam agents. They're not enabled by default, but you can enable them in much the same way you enabled them in Exchange 2010 on your Hub Transport server roles. So you would run a PowerShell script to install the agents and get them working. The only thing here that's different is that with Exchange 2010, after you enabled the anti-spam agents, you could then configure the various agents through the GUI console, through the Exchange Management Console. And so a new tab would show up and you'd be able to work with them. The same way when you work on an Edge Transport server, there's a tab for the anti-spam agents. And so in that case, you don't have to enable them. It's by default. And so that's Microsoft's way of saying, hey, we wanted you to use these Edge Transport servers, and that's why even though it's available on the Hub Transport server side, we didn't enable them by default. So fair enough. You can enable them, and the same is true on Exchange 2013. You can enable these on your mailbox servers. However, the difference is with 2013, you do not have a GUI method of configuring the anti-spam agents. So in those cases, you have to use PowerShell commandlets. Now you might be thinking, hey, that's important, and it might even be something that comes up on the exam. Well, that's accurate actually. It's something that you are going to need to look into is the configuration of anti-spam through PowerShell commandlets. But not to worry, this is a subject that we will actually dive deeper into in a future lesson. So just keep in mind that it's part of the design here that you can enable them on your mailbox servers. If you're not going to go with an Edge Transport server, that's okay. You can enable anti-spam on your mailbox server. But configuration, that's going to be a little bit tricky if you don't know the PowerShell commandlets. Now, the other part to message hygiene is the built-in anti-malware settings that are part of Exchange 2013. So these features, they're not super robust, but it's new to Exchange, so perhaps over time we'll start to see more and more added to this as far as the various feature possibilities. For now, it's enabled and there's a way to configure it through the GUI, so that's a positive thing over the anti-spam settings, and you have the ability to go in there and configure it so that you can make sure that mail is not passed through into your organization or sent from your organization if it does have some type of malware attached. But you can configure the settings so that mail coming into your organization or leaving your organization does not include malware. So you want to make sure that messages are not infected with malware, and also that administrators that are responsible for protecting the environment are notified. Well, that's pretty much what the anti-malware settings can do. One final thing that we want to talk about here under this topic of designing transport is the idea of a shared namespace solution. So this is just something that comes up from time to time. There are times when you need to share between two different companies an email domain. So why would you do that? Well, one example is where two companies, they merge, but they maintain separate systems, separate Active Directory forests. And so you have two separate domain names going on there, but you're going to merge now and utilize a single email alias. And so if we're looking at, let's say, domain A and domain B, let's say these are two different companies. Domain A is one Active Directory domain, domain B is another. Well, if they merge together, they can do this with a new email alias finalized as domainc.com. Now, how do you make this work? Well, you have to have your domain configured as an authoritative domain in your accepted domains list. But what you're going to do is you're going to change the domain type to an internal relay. And you're going to create a send connector that tells Exchange where to send the emails that do not have a local recipient. So the configuration side is obviously a little bit more complex than what's being mentioned here. This is the basic overview of what you're going to need to do. But the important part here is to understand that this is possible. You can have a single namespace that's shared between two different organizations. And so obviously, it will take some time to configure this, but from a design perspective, if you have, let's say, in the case of our company that we're working with, our scenario company, if they came back to us and said, hey, look, we're going to merge with this other company, and they make 3D products as well, and we want to use a different finalized email alias, but we're going to keep our organizations as is and keep them separate, that's doable. And so it's important from a design perspective that you know that. All right, so jumping back into a discussion regarding our scenario, and really when it comes to planning their transport, it's not so much that we can just jump right in and start making suggestions, because there were a lot of unanswered questions that need to be answered first. So we have to know, where will the additional sites that are planned, where will they be? And then certainly what kind of connectivity will those sites have? We might also need to know what level of control we have over the Active Directory environment, and then we could start planning whether or not we need to make adjustments to Exchange site link costs. So that's something that we can do, but we want to just first know, where are these sites going to be, what kind of connectivity, what type of control do we have. All of that is important. And then as far as partnerships, we mentioned that, let's say they might want to partner up with another company. So what kind of partnership? Do the partnerships being planned to require added security for transport between persons within the company? And so in that case, you might set up send and receive connectors that require the various security settings that you're looking for. Perhaps you're not looking to have secured partnerships in that sense. Maybe you prefer to federate with the other organization. We haven't talked about federation or organization or sharing policies at this point, but it's another type of connectivity to partners on the outside. We also talked about shared namespaces. You may start off as being partners and then eventually merge together completely. So there's a lot of questions that have to be answered, and some things aren't answerable within the first 5 minutes of a discussion. Some things become more apparent over time, or things change. So to start with, if there are partnerships being planned, then it would be good to know if it's necessary to have a more secure line of communication between the two. And if not, then you can simply create send connectors that go to smart hosts or to the outside internet, and then that mail will be routed to those partnered organizations in the same way that it's sent to pretty much every other organization that you actually send an email to. Now, with the company we're talking about here, they currently use Edge Transport Server with 2010. So you might need to know, will those be continued when you transition to Exchange 2013? Do you want those to continue? Would a third-party hosted solution offer additional features that might be better? In fact, are the built-in message hygiene options sufficient, or should we start looking at third-party options for message hygiene as well? Just because it's built right in doesn't necessarily mean that that's what we want to work with. Sure, it's free, but perhaps we have reasons to lean another way. Perhaps the organization wants, in addition to what's built into Exchange, a third-party hosted solution perhaps to add another layer of anti-spam and antivirus protection. So in the world of excessive junk that comes into your organization, it feels like you can never have enough message hygiene solutions to help keep your mailboxes clean. And then, as we were just talking about, are there plans to merge with other companies? And if so, what kind of namespace planning is needed? So are there partnerships in place that may actually morph into something that's more of a joint venture between two companies, where now you're looking at a shared namespace? So again, a lot to think about when it comes to planning and designing, but it's good to know that you have options, and obviously through a discussion of all of these different features that are built into Exchange and what Exchange can do, knowing that there are options can help you when it comes to design decisions. The same is true on the certification exam. If you're taking the exam and you're presented with different options, if you're not even aware that some of these options are even possible, well, then you'll never be able to meditate on the question, look at the scenario that's being provided, and then, based on the facts, choose an appropriate design decision. So this certification exam requires a lot of knowledge in order to be able to choose wisely based upon what Exchange can and cannot do. Obviously, we want you to be as prepared as possible for not just the certification exam itself, but for really any situation that comes your way in real-life deployments of Exchange 2013. And so much of what we have just discussed, it's a lot of information to take in all at once, and it's really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the surrounding and supportive material that goes into a discussion like this. And so it's important that you take the time, and we recommend that you find the time to do a little bit more research. So in this case, we're looking at several different articles that are listed here: mail routing, understanding message routing from the Exchange 2010 side, and that's because the actual routing between 2010 and 2013 is the same. We're talking about site costs, site link costs, and so forth. So this is a great article that helps to really round out your knowledge of that. Use an Edge Transport Server in Exchange 2013, and then Exchange 2013 Client Access Server role. That's actually from the Exchange team blog. It's a great overview of all of the different changes to the Client Access Server role, and it helps when it comes to understanding a little bit some of the configuration changes when it comes to putting all of this together. So we know that this is a lot to take in all at once. We hope you found it informative. We'd like to thank you for viewing, and I'll see you in the next lesson.